Welcome, everybody, to today's Building My Legacy podcast. I have with me today Lizzie Horvitz. She has a company called Finch, and she is very interesting because she became passionate about both her avocation as well as what's become her vocation now when she was only 16 years old. That, I think, is pretty amazing. So Liz works in education, talking about sustainability, all the ins and outs of how to be sustainable, and what is required of that for a company to be a sustainable company. So she's got a tremendous amount of experience. She's worked with Unilever. She has since then developed all these various programs. So Liz, before we get into a whole lot of the specifics, please tell the audience how at 16 the light bulbs went off and you suddenly decided that you're going to really learn about this. And is that when you went off grid and used wind and other natural sources to live? Okay, tell us about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a thrill to be on. I had the opportunity to live in the Bahamas when I was 16. I had been at the same school from preschool all the way until 10th grade, and my wonderful parents gave me the opportunity to do this sort of study abroad in the Bahamas. And that is
Not a bad thing to be given.
It was not a bad thing. And the school was completely run on wind and solar. Our gas came from vegetable oil from old cruise ships. So it was incredibly sustainable. And at the time, this was 2004, I was only 16. And frankly, I didn't know anything about climate change. It wasn't discussed as much as it is today. And so what I always say is that I saw the solution before I fully understood the problem. I saw this beautiful way of living that reduces your impact significantly before I really knew the harms of climate change at large. And so that just set me off on a path where I wanted to dedicate my life towards giving everybody access to this type of lifestyle that protected the planet and protect ourselves. And really then, had my college career based around that. And then I realized early in my post-college career that the world's biggest issues were probably going to be solved in the private sector. I love the nonprofit world. I love, we need the governments to move things forward as well, but the private sector is where a lot of the action is happening. And I didn't have the skills to do that. And so that's when I went to get my MBA and my Master in Environmental Management. And then from there, I just became very interested in particularly what companies can do to reduce their carbon footprint.
So let me ask you, going back to your Bahamas experience, was your school unique, or was that sort of a adopted philosophy in the community in which you were living?
So I'm from Cleveland, and the school. Are you talking about the
Your
school
school in the
where I came from, or in the
Bahamas.
Bahamas?
Yeah.
So in the Bahamas, we did place-based learning, which meant that every single thing that we did had to do with our surroundings, right? And so that ranged from measuring the angle of the wind generator to taking our tests underwater with waterproof pieces of paper. So there was no sort of like sitting in a classroom and learning about something that happened, thousands of miles away, which meant that we really did infiltrate into the rest of the community, which was fantastic. We volunteered at the local middle schools and high schools. A lot of the students locally were able to attend the island school. And so we really transformed this little part of Eleuthera in the Bahamas into a real sustainability haven.
Okay, so this an experiment then that your school in Cleveland was doing in the Bahamas? Is that how you
The school in the Bahamas had a lot of different high schools that were partnering, and my school in Cleveland happened to be one of them, but there were dozens of schools that sort of um, chose to send students from their other high
okay?
schools.
So it was an ecosystem of its own, of people, students from based largely from the US
Yes.
communities coming to learn about the environment in the Bahamas, but it was not a Bahamas program.
It was not. I'd have to check honestly. It's not really a Bahamian program, but I mean, they're very involved in the Bahamian government and
Yeah,
community.
yeah. No, I'm just curious because it's
Yeah.
always so fascinating to see how things get started and then keep generating their own energy. So that's remarkable. So then you are now involved in education. Why education, first of all? And then what in particular with education are you most concerned about communicating?
What's really interesting, I don't actually think of myself as being in education. I think of myself as trying to minimize our footprint at large in the world. And so my end goal is really to work with companies to make sure that their products are not harming the planet and the people.
Okay.
And so the lever to do that I've chosen to be, I guess, education. So in a way that's absolutely true. And this came out because I really saw a need for it. I don't have a natural inclination towards entrepreneurship. I now feel like I do, but I never sort of thought of myself as wanting to start a company until really I was at another startup and just fell in love with the whole experience. But while I was at Unilever, I had all my friends and family coming to me with questions because I'm one of the only people with sort of a formal advanced background in this space. People would say, I'm buying new sunscreen. Are there any ingredients that I should avoid? Or I'm flying across the country. Do I need to be vegan to offset that, et cetera, et cetera? And I didn't know where to point them. There was nothing online that I could find that sort of struck that middle balance of this is based in scientific data, but also it's fun and accessible to read. Similar to, I don't know if you're familiar with NerdWallet, but we always call ourselves sort of the NerdWallet for sustainability because what NerdWallet did for personal finance is making it fun and accessible to figure out which credit card you should buy and what mortgage you should get, etc. And there was nothing like that existed in the sustainability space, and so it was really exciting for us starting out to sort of fill that gap.
So you work with companies relative to their products. How do you approach them and what's their receptivity to what you talk about?
So we actually don't have formal partnerships with companies. We scrape information about these products across the public domain. So anything that companies publish publicly, we have access to, just like anybody on the internet has access to, and we manipulate that information to turn it into a score between 1 and 10, and then we'll pop out a score. Oftentimes, companies will come to us and say, I think you missed some information, or our score should be higher, and we say, that's fine, and we would love if you could give us additional information, but it has to be posted somewhere publicly because as a tiny team of only 5 full-time employees, we can't possibly vet companies coming to us saying, oh yeah, we're paying for carbon offsets or we're doing X, Y, and Z unless they have published it somewhere. And so that's sort of our interaction with them now, and it's mostly friendly. Companies really love what we're doing. They have a hard time marketing their sustainability, and so if companies are doing well, generally they appreciate what we're up to, and if they're not, they would rather we sweep everything under the rug. And so it sort of runs the gamut, but we've had pretty positive responses, and then over time, as we gain more users, we'll be able to gather data that's very valuable to brands and then sell that to them and have a more formal partnership.
So, what are the criteria you use to measure a company's products?
So we have 6 different sort of areas of focus. The first is climate, sort of what is that larger climate impact, really by carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. The next is water. The third is human well-being. And then we have ecological footprint, which is essentially sort of what's the impact a product has on its biodiversity, including to the extent to which it harms or benefits local ecosystems. The fifth is waste, of course, how this product is recycled, if it's recyclable, et cetera, how long it lasts. And then what's the raw materials footprint? And so with those six, we integrate those and we weight them differently depending on the product. And then we overlay that with real reviews. So one thing that's unique about Finch is that there are a lot of companies that can tell you sort of what the most sustainable things are to look for, but you don't know if that's a good user experience. You don't know if you like bamboo toilet paper or not. And so we integrate, right now it's just Amazon reviews, but eventually we'll have sort of our own system where we can see, okay, this product gets a very high score from a sustainability standpoint, but it falls apart or it doesn't feel good or what have you, so that we can really point people in the right direction and make sure that nobody has to compromise when they're making a sustainable decision.
So you talked, I think number 3 was human well-being.
Mm-hmm.
How do you measure that?
We measure that in a couple of different ways. It's one of my favorite categories because it is so multifaceted. The first is the toxicity levels of these products, right? How harmful are these chemicals to our health? And so that would be, a paraben or aluminum in deodorant or the presence of these certain ingredients or materials. Something that people don't think about often is the human health impact on the manufacturing workers. So before it gets to our doorsteps when we're using it, how is this being made and is it harmful to the people? So that could be people just being exposed to certain chemicals. It could be child labor use, particularly in more developing countries. So it sort of it scans all of those, and we use existing resources. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel in any way, and we use many existing resources like EPA Made Safe is one of them, or EWG, the Environmental Working Group, who have sort of done a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So we're able to go and say, okay, what are the ingredients we should be really focused on?
So at this point, Liz, how many companies have you rated and impacted in terms of their products? Do you keep records of that?
We do. We have rated around 285,000 products. And in terms of companies, that's probably around maybe 50,000, I think, of all different types.
So when a product doesn't rate well, do you then help them figure out what to do in order to make the product better?
That's the goal, definitely. We're not quite there yet, but that is the goal of, your your product scored a 6 out of 10. 20% of people who searched for this product ended up going with the product that got a 9 out of 10. Let's help you get to that 9, right? And we can share information, which is helpful actually to all different types of companies. Large companies sometimes are just a little bit behind the 8 ball and haven't invested what they should have. And then smaller companies, especially, they're just getting off the ground. They want to do the best that they can, but they're not affording a sustainability consultant or certainly not a chief sustainability officer. So that's a really good opportunity for Finch to come in and help guide them on these right decisions.
So, of the companies that you've looked at, give us an example of one of your favorite products that you looked at and said, wow, if only every product could be like this. What would that be an example of, or do you have an example of that?
Sure. I think two come to mind. The first is a company called The Last Swab or The Last Object, I think. And they make reusable products that are normally disposable. So what I have is it's not a Q-tip because that's the brand, but it's I can't think of a cotton swab, but it's made out of sort of silicone, and so you just use it wherever, like with makeup or in your ears or anything like that, and then you just pour water on it and you wash it off, and you can reuse it forever. So I've had mine for now 2.5 years. There's no reason to ever use a Q-tip again for me. And it's fantastic. And so that's just the type of innovation where if you think of how much is wasted by individually using a cotton swab every single day, you can just save so much packaging and materials and energy. So that's one. And then the second, which is along similar lines is a company called High Bar, which makes shampoo bars. And so, like body wash, you have a bar of soap or you have liquid body wash. Shampoo is now moving towards that direction where you can get liquid shampoo or you can get a bar of shampoo. And that just minimizes the footprint so significantly because, if you think about it, shampoo and conditioner's number one ingredient is water. It's filled mostly with water. And obviously when you're in the shower, you don't need that water. You already have it from the shower. And so these concentrated solutions of a bar just make it really easier to ship the product. They're lighter and they last longer and it's just more efficient.
What's the difference in cost?
There's really not a difference in cost in a lot of these products. I think that's a big it's a misconception that we're trying to break down, that oftentimes sustainability products are just more efficient. And so buying, for instance, the last swab versus a pack of cotton swabs, the pack of cotton swabs are going to be less expensive at the store, but the last swab lasts significantly longer, right? And so that type of analysis is not always being done to make people think that to participate in the sustainability, movement, you need to spend more money. It is the case sometimes because you're paying people fair wages and you're using more high quality materials, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes for the demographics of people who can afford it, I always recommend it's worth it because you're ensuring that these people are doing a better job. But in many cases, you're at cost parity and it's a pretty good deal.
So if a company hasn't really gotten into the sustainability movement in a significant way, where would you suggest they begin? How do they begin this process?
It's a really good question. We have Wise Guides where we look at each individual product category and we go through, here are the most important factors to pay attention to, right? For shampoo, it might be the packaging. For detergent, it's probably the ingredients. And so we really break down exactly what to look for and what aspects will move the needle the most so that companies aren't, buying recycled plastic when in reality that's not making a huge difference or what have you. And so I would definitely start with our Wise Guides. And then, the fun thing about being at the stage, we're only 2 years old, is that we have a real personal relationship with a lot of our users and a lot of the brands. And so I always suggest people email me or the team to ask any questions, and we're happy to sort of put our heads together and find a solution.
Great. What a great resource, because I think knowledge is one of the things that holds people back. Mm-hmm. And it's also the fear of doing it wrong because there's so many opinions about sustainability. What is important? What isn't important? And
exactly.
Right.
Yes.
So Liz, if you were to wave a magic wand and make things happen, so we had sustainable businesses in terms of climate, in terms of environment, what would that one magic wand be that you would?
Such a good question. Oh my goodness. I wish I had thought about this because there are so many different directions to go. What I would probably do is create a recycling system that actually was able to give more than 90% of the things we throw away a second life. I think there's so much waste in what we throw away. And I think if we could figure out the R&D to just throw everything in one bin and make sure that everything that's supposed to is getting an opportunity to become a new product, that would just make a really huge difference in the amount of energy we're using to make new products, in the methane released at the landfill, in just a lot of different ways. And I think that would go a long way.
So as people in their companies are wanting to have a conversation about this in their workplace, they're getting started, they want a conversation, how would you suggest they approach it so they really get people enrolled?
You know what always worked for us at companies was having a green team and making it really fun. People don't like to be shamed into feeling like they're doing the wrong thing or feeling badly about their actions. The last thing I want is for someone to feel embarrassed because they're using a disposable water bottle. And we're big fans of progress, not perfection, right? Everybody's doing what they can, and we're not asking more than that. And so within a company environment, I think it's really good to have sort of competitions. If you're on a multi-level office, it could be by floor, and you could figure out, who is able to recycle the most, or um, who had the best idea for X, Y, and Z innovations regarding sustainability. So the first thing is to just bring together a green team, figure out who in the office is also like-minded and willing to spend, a couple hours a month on this. And then to get the rest of the office involved, it's always, people love competitions, people love to win. And so making it fun in that way goes a long way.
What's changed? Anything changed since COVID in terms of consumer expectations for companies and their sustainability?
I think there are both good and bad things that have happened. On the bad side, I'll start with that. People are so much more concerned with cleanliness, and it's often misplaced. So, for example, right when COVID started, and luckily it's coming back, but you couldn't bring your own mug to a coffee shop because you had to use a disposable one. There's really that just doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you're accepting a dollar bill from someone who's paying you, you can accept their reusable cup. And so the distinctions that these companies were making were really tough and often didn't make a lot of sense. And so that was tough to see, and I think it's taking a long time to get back to that, where let's just not worry about the COVID, let's not worry about, spreading this, and let's just use, disposable flatware and napkins and cups and all of that stuff. So that's been a problem. I think on the good side, and this is very meta, but for a long time, manufacturing was halted, nobody was flying. You could see a difference in the atmosphere, right? Particularly in places like Hong Kong, Venice, areas that are normally a bit more polluted. Um, they looked completely different, almost unrecognizable for the first time. And so I think in many ways it gave people the opportunity to see, okay, this is what the world could look like if we just lowered our reliance on fossil fuels a little bit. And it was kind of like a tease, where before COVID, we had to sort of imagine that in our heads, and which was very tough to do. And now, we've seen that reality. We've seen how good it could be. Let's try to get there.
So, do you see like in the countries you just mentioned, do you see that those countries continue those practices now that we're moving past COVID? Or do they now say, we're back to all the cars, we're back to whatever it is that makes them less climate or environment oriented?
I think generally people have come back, unfortunately. I don't think there have been a lot of lasting benefits from that side. I will say the shift in remote working, I think, has helped a lot, because there are just less people commuting overall. And so I think that's been a good thing. But generally, what's happened right when manufacturing started kicking into gear again was that almost they were doing double the amount because they were catching up for 2 years. So it's not all good, but I think enough happened that sort of changed people's perspectives. And even if we're not seeing the benefits right now, they might be lasting for a couple of years.
Got it. So you also talk, well, part of what goes with environment and sustainability is, how do we measure it? How do we know? So there's a certain amount of transparency that goes with that. What do you think is most important relative to transparency for believability with consumers?
I think there's not really a factor that's more important than another. For example, like, I wouldn't say that, chemical transparency is more important than packaging or anything like that. It really just depends on so many different factors. What I will say is sharing. I wish that companies had more faith in consumers to share exactly what made the product sustainable, as opposed to just saying this is sustainable, or worse yet, this is eco-friendly or green, because those words are not regulated, they don't mean anything. And instead, if companies could say, we are um, we are made in the United States. We're not manufacturing in other countries that use child labor, or we are without X, Y, and Z ingredients, etc. Then they don't have to sugarcoat it with these special words that don't mean anything. They can just be honest about how they're making their product. And, the more transparent they are about that, the less we think they have to hide. The companies that don't share that much information, we have to assume the worst. Because there's no reason to not, right? Like, there's no reason to not share that information if you're making these good decisions.
So, when you work on sustainability and with companies, do you use the UN criteria, their sustainability criteria that they work with, especially with developing countries?
We do, kind of, yes. We use the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are, a couple of them that fit in perfectly with our work, but we don't really have the exact criteria. Ours is much less policy based and much more science based.
Got it. Okay, because I was going to say, I have seen some of those applications to be designated as such, and it is quite political in many ways in terms of what you do. And you sit back and you go, okay, how will this impact actually? But indeed, they choose those things because they see that as one approach that makes a difference.
And it does, very much so.
What do you see coming down the pike? Right now, we're seeing an economy that is becoming tighter. I think there's a new level of uncertainty that we're moving into geopolitically also right now. What happens to people's interest in the environment during such times?
I think there are always competing priorities. I don't think that this is particularly different than what was 4 years ago or even 10 years ago in terms of other things to focus on. I think, if anything, people are seeing more and more firsthand what climate change can do. And so, what gives me a lot of hope is that Gen Z specifically is really demanding this type of transparency. And according to Deloitte, they care more about climate change than any other factor facing the planet, or facing the world. And so, as they grow older and become more, responsible for purchasing power, etc., that's going to change the landscape, and companies really won't be able to get away with not being transparent and not sharing this information anymore. But I also think simultaneously, because of that, the onus will be less on the consumer in many ways, because these companies will need to take it upon themselves. So I am craving a world in which Finch doesn't need to exist, because any product that's being made is good, is reaching that level of, this is not going to ruin our planet. And so, as we move more towards that, consumers can sort of rest knowing that they don't have to make huge behavior changes or care about this personally, to ensure that something's happening that's good.
What are some important things that we should have talked about, Liz, that we've not covered that companies should know as they're working on improving their sustainability, their environment approach, or they're getting ready to enter into this in a more serious fashion?
I think, the one most important thing that I would say is, this journey for anybody, whether you're, P&G or a company with one employee, it's a marathon, not a sprint. In other words, these changes will not happen overnight. They're going to take time, and we all need to be really patient, including the consumers. But companies need to, when they hear we're not going to be able to get this certain material for another 5 years, it's worth waiting for, because this takes a really long time, and it's, ideally we could have started yesterday, but if that didn't happen, then let's start today in and start making that change.
So how long do you think it'll be before we've made the tipping point where people are really self-motivated, disciplined in terms of monitoring their own sustainability and environmental approach?
I honestly don't know if it will ever happen, and that's okay because companies will do it. I don't think that we cannot depend on the consumers to at large change in the fundamental way that needs to happen. There's will always be sort of 5% to 7% of the population, we call them really dark green, who are vegan and never fly again, and are making these really huge lifestyle choices on behalf of the planet. And I applaud them, and I'm so grateful that those people exist, but that's not the majority of the world. And so I think that the more we can get governments, nonprofits, and companies to really step up and make these changes so that consumers don't have to, the better.
Got it. So when you said not fly, there goes a lot of people's vacations, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So those are huge asks, and perhaps it'll happen.
Perhaps.
Your biggest piece of advice you want to leave with the audience is what?
My biggest piece of advice is to find something that you really love doing that you can turn into a job. I think I feel very lucky that I get to spend the majority of my week doing something that I really like to do, and hopefully getting paid for it at some point. And so I think there's such a need, particularly in the climate space, but anything that is interesting to people. Everybody needs a whole diverse set of skills and interests, and so it's worth finding that thing and sticking to it.
On that note, Liz, we will close this podcast, and thank you so much. If people want more information, good place for them to go. Do you have a website?
Yeah, absolutely. We're choosefinch.com, and then you can email us at hey@choosefinch.com, and then our Twitter and Instagram are both @choosefinch.
Okay, Choose Finch. Choose as this, I'm going to choose this, and Finch, Finch.
Yes.
So please be sure to visit Liz and Finch to learn more about what you can do to become sustainable and to develop products that are good for our environment. So Liz, thank you so much for being with us today on Building My Legacy podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. And for those of you who are listening to our podcast today, thank you for being with us. And please remember to visit our website as well at www.buildtomorrow.com with the number 2. And our brand new website, www.startwithcollaboration.com. So again, thanks so much, Liz.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell button above. Leave comments. We'd love to hear what you think. And visit our other social media links as well. Thanks much.